Yeah, this hearing is still going on. It has been going on for about 2 hours now. You talk about graphic, you talk about disturbing. I've been a reporter now for almost 20 years. I've seen and I've heard an awful lot of things, but to hear somebody describe in detail how he and his friends tortured a woman and then killed her, honestly, it's the most disturbing thing I've ever heard. None of the 6 defendants said a word as they arrived at court this morning, but inside the courtroom, the taped statement of suspect Melvin Knight did plenty of talking. According to detectives, they interviewed Knight just hours after they had discovered the body of 30-year-old Jennifer Daugherty. Knight describes in great detail how they tortured Daugherty for 36 hours before they killed her. According to the statement, it started when Daugherty made a pass at defendant Ricky Smyrnes. Smyrnes' girlfriend, Angie Marinucci, got angry and started beating Daugherty. The others joined in, including Knight and Amber Meidinger.
This particular case is just unimaginable. I don't know that Stephen King could have made it up, to be honest with you.
I remember thinking to myself, holy crap, just violent.
It was the most horrific, disgusting, despicable case in the history of Westmoreland County jurisprudence. I mean, it was the worst case you can imagine.
February 11th, 2010, Greensburg, Pennsylvania. In the parking lot of the Greensburg Salem Middle School, a man walks out to his pickup truck and finds something that doesn't belong there. A garbage can, pushed underneath the vehicle, out of place, in a lot he crosses every day. He moves it, and inside that garbage can is the body of a woman. She has not been there long. The medical examiner will determine she has been dead less than a day. She is 30 years old, and she is not from Greensburg. 3 days earlier, she had taken a bus into this town for a doctor's appointment. That was all. A routine trip she had made many times before, on her own, the way she liked to do things. That afternoon, she had called her mother and asked if she could stay the night with a friend. Her mother said yes. What happened inside the apartment where she stayed is one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of Westmoreland County, and the single hardest part to understand is not how she died. It's this. Before she died, the people in that apartment called a meeting. They gathered in a room with her, and they went around it, one by one, and they voted on whether she would live. 6 people, 6 votes. Not one of them voted to let her live. Her name was Jennifer Lee Daugherty, and she thought every single person in that room was her friend. You're watching Crime Watch Cold Case. Over the next 40 minutes, we're going to walk through everything that happened inside a second-floor apartment on North Pennsylvania Avenue. A case Westmoreland County prosecutors described as one of the most brutal they had ever brought before a jury. It produced 2 death sentences, 12 years of court proceedings, and a change to Pennsylvania law that still stands today. Before we begin, a word for our viewers. This is a real case. Jennifer Daugherty was a real person, and her family is still living with what happened to her. This episode contains descriptions of prolonged abuse, sexual violence, and murder. We won't be dwelling on those details for shock value, but they are part of the record, and we will be discussing them. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. If this subject is difficult for you, please take care of yourself. If this is the kind of coverage you want more of, subscribe before we start. And we do start where Jennifer started, on a bus, 3 days before she died. To understand how Jennifer Daugherty ended up in that apartment, you first have to understand the country she was living in. February 2010. America was 18 months past the collapse of the financial system, and still nowhere near out of it. National unemployment was sitting just under 10%, the worst in more than a quarter century. Millions of families had lost their homes, and the recovery economists were starting to talk about had not arrived in places like Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. This is old coal and steel country, 30 miles east of Pittsburgh. Towns built around mills and mines that closed decades ago and were never replaced by anything. Greensburg is the county seat, a small city of about 15,000 people. with a courthouse dome you can see from the highway, and a downtown that had been thinning out for 40 years. Two things about that particular winter matter more than all the rest. Hold on to both of them, because they come back at the end of this story. The first is that Pennsylvania was in a budget crisis. The state had gone more than 100 days past its deadline the previous year without passing a budget, and county human services absorbed the damage. Mental health programs, intellectual disability supports, case management. Adults with intellectual disabilities were living more independently than they would have a decade earlier, with fewer people checking on them. The second is housing, shelters, transitional housing, month-to-month apartments rented to whoever could cover the first month. People with criminal records, untreated mental illness, and no family left to fall back on ended up in the same buildings, sharing the same walls, and nobody was responsible for any of them. And then there was the snow. On February 5th and 6th, a storm the region still calls Snowmageddon dropped almost 22 inches on Pittsburgh. Parts of western Pennsylvania got more than 2 feet. 3 days later, a second storm rolled in and added 8 more on top of it. Neighborhoods went silent. Nobody was outside. Nobody was walking past windows. None of that excuses what 6 people did inside an apartment on North Pennsylvania Avenue. But it goes a long way toward explaining why, for 3 days, nobody outside it noticed. Jennifer Lee Daugherty was born on November 8, 1979, and grew up in Mount Pleasant, Pennsylvania, a borough of about 4,000 people, roughly 15 minutes down the road from Greensburg. She had 2 sisters, Joy and Jamie, her mother, Denise, her stepfather, Bobby Murphy, who had raised her, a stepbrother, Dave, and nieces and a nephew who knew her simply as Aunt Jennifer. Jennifer had an intellectual disability. Her family described her as functioning at roughly the level of a 12 to 14-year-old. That's useful shorthand, and it's also misleading, so it's worth being precise about what it did and did not mean. It did not mean she was a child. She was a 30-year-old woman. She had opinions, preferences, a sense of humor, a temper when she wanted one. She wanted the things adults want: her own money, her own space, and friends she had chosen herself instead of friends arranged for her by somebody else. What it did mean was that she missed things, social cues, subtext, that particular signal most adults read without ever knowing they're reading it, the sense that someone is being kind to you for a reason. And she was independent, fiercely so. She rode the bus alone, about 10 miles, Mount Pleasant to Greensburg, a trip she made regularly and by herself, for dental appointments, for counseling, for the community center where she spent her time. Her stepfather would drop her at the station. Jennifer handled the rest. That independence was not a small thing. It was the center of her life. It was what she was proudest of, and it was what her family had worked hardest to give her. She called home every day, and every one of those calls ended the same way. She told them she loved them. In the weeks before February of 2010, Jennifer told her family something that made them happy. She'd made friends. She'd been going to a community center in Greensburg, the kind of place where adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities can take classes, get support, and spend time around other people. And there, she said, she'd met some. She came home with names: Peggy, Amber. Her parents didn't press for details. They didn't ask who these people were, or where they lived, or how old they were. Her stepfather said afterward that he had never met a single one of them. He knew the names only because Jennifer had said them out loud at the dinner table. And it's worth sitting with why they didn't push. Because for 30 years, the hardest part of loving Jennifer had been letting go of her. Every family raising an adult with a disability lives inside the same impossible question: how much freedom is too much? hold on too tight, and you take away the only life she actually wants. Loosen your grip, and you have to accept that you cannot see where she is. They chose to trust her judgment. They chose to be glad for her. Her sister Joy would describe her later, in a single sentence that explains everything that comes next. She trusted everybody. She believed everyone was good, and that no one would hurt her. Monday, February 8th, 2010. The snow from Snowmageddon was still piled in gray banks along the roads in Mount Pleasant. Jennifer had a doctor's appointment in Greensburg the next day, and a plan she was looking forward to. Go up Monday, stay the night, make the appointment Tuesday morning, and be home by Tuesday afternoon. Before she left the house, she wrote a note for her mother, who was already at work. It was short. She hoped Denise had a good day. She told her she loved her very much, and that she'd talk to her later on. Then her stepfather drove her to the bus station. Bobby Murphy was 62 years old. He had made this drive dozens of times. There was nothing about that morning that felt like anything at all. She kissed him on the cheek, said goodbye, and got on the bus. He was the last member of her family to see her alive. Sometime that afternoon, Jennifer called home. She'd arrived in Greensburg, and she asked her mother a question she had asked before. Could she spend the night at her friend Peggy's? Denise Murphy said yes. Sit with the position she was in for a moment. Her 30-year-old daughter, who has made this trip alone many times, is asking permission to stay over with a friend. Saying no means saying something much larger. It means you don't get to have friends. You don't get a life of your own. I don't trust you out there. She said yes. Of course she said yes. They talked a little longer. And then, the way every call between them had always ended, they told each other they loved each other. And Jennifer hung up. That was the last time Denise Murphy heard her daughter's voice. North Pennsylvania Avenue runs through a residential stretch of Greensburg. 2-story houses, most of them long since cut into apartments, front porches sitting close to the sidewalk. The apartment was on the 2nd floor. A woman and her family lived directly below it. By February of 2010, 6 adults were living up there. Not one of them had steady work. The apartment was Ricky Smyrnes's. Prosecutors would later describe him as the head of the household, but the arrangement was informal, in the way these arrangements usually are. People arrived, people stayed. Nobody signed anything. Melvin Knight and Amber Meidinger moved in on the same day Jennifer arrived. Before that, they'd been in a hotel. Before that, a homeless shelter. Before that, several other places, over a matter of weeks. At least one other man later testified that he stayed at the apartment regularly, that it was simply the kind of place where you could turn up and find a floor to sleep on. And that is the detail that matters most about this building. There was nobody in it with the standing to make anybody leave. No landlord counting heads. No lease with names on it. No caseworker scheduled to knock. 6 adults, several with criminal records, several with untreated psychiatric conditions, sharing a handful of rooms on a street where nobody was outside, because there were 2 feet of snow on the ground. So let's talk about who was in that apartment. Ricky Smyrnes, 23 years old that February. Prosecutors identified him as the one who organized what happened, the head of the household, the person who called the meetings. At the time, he had an outstanding warrant against him on unrelated charges. His own history came out later, at his penalty trial, and a jury heard all of it. He had been in and out of foster placements and treatment from early childhood. He was first treated for mental health problems at 4 years old. Defense witnesses testified that he had been physically and sexually abused by relatives, that he was exposed to hard drugs before the age of 7, and that he'd been diagnosed over the years with post-traumatic stress disorder and a range of other conditions. One expert told the jury that the thing Ricky Smyrnes learned as a small child was how to be helpless, None of that persuaded the judge to let jurors hear about his mental capacity during the guilt phase of his trial, and none of it persuaded that jury to spare his life. Angela Marinucci, 17, a high school senior. She was Smyrnes' girlfriend, and she was the only one of the 6 who could not be sentenced to death, solely because of her age. The prosecution's theory was that she was the prime instigator, that she was jealous of Jennifer, that she had said out loud, before the killing, that she wanted Jennifer dead. Her defense attorney argued something close to the opposite, that it was absurd to believe a 17-year-old had directed 5 adults, some of them twice her age, and that Smyrnes was the one pulling every string in that apartment. Which one of those is true is the question the courts would spend the next 12 years trying to settle. Melvin Knight, 20. He'd met Amber Meidinger at a homeless shelter weeks earlier. He knew Smyrnes from a stretch they'd served in jail together. He moved into that apartment on the same day Jennifer walked into it. He would eventually plead guilty to first-degree murder. He admitted to police that he was the one who stabbed her. Amber Meidinger, 20, Knight's girlfriend, and pregnant. She would give birth to Knight's daughter while sitting in the Westmoreland County Prison awaiting trial. And she would become the most important witness in this entire case. The person who took the stand and described what happened inside those rooms, hour by hour. When she testified against Smyrnes, she did it with no plea agreement in place, while the district attorney was still telling reporters he intended to seek the death penalty against her. Peggy Miller, 27. Peggy is the name Jennifer said to her mother on the telephone. Peggy is the friend Jennifer believed she was going to stay with. Of the 6 people in that apartment, Peggy Miller is the one Jennifer would have called a real friend. What Peggy Miller said in a courtroom years later is, without question, the most devastating sentence anyone connected to this case has ever spoken out loud. We'll come back to it. Robert Masters, 36, the oldest person in the building by nearly a decade. He had no romantic stake in any of this. He wasn't competing for anybody's attention. He was, by every account, including his own, a bystander. When he was finally sentenced, his explanation was that he had been afraid, that he should have done something, and he didn't. Hold on to that one too. So what set it off? At some point, after Jennifer arrived, she said something about Ricky Smyrnes. Depending on which account you follow, she said she was going to marry him, or that the 2 of them were involved. To Jennifer, it was harmless, the kind of thing she'd say out loud, to anyone, with no sense at all that it might land badly. Angela Marinucci heard it. Smyrnes, in his own recorded statement to police, told a different version. He said he had rejected Jennifer, and that she was making people angry. He would spend the rest of the case pointing at his roommates. But the prosecution's position never changed. At every trial, in front of every jury, John Peck argued the same thing, that everything which happened over the next 3 days grew out of a 17-year-old's jealousy. A woman died because a teenager was jealous. That's the whole reason. There isn't a deeper one. Monday afternoon, February 8th, the Greensburg bus station. Jennifer had arrived. She wasn't alone. Ricky Smyrnes was there to meet her, and so were Angela Marinucci, Peggy Miller, and Robert Masters. While they were standing there, 2 more people walked up, Melvin Knight and Amber Meidinger. They'd been staying in a hotel nearby and had run out of money. Smyrnes offered them a place to stay, and Amber Meidinger recognized Jennifer. The 2 of them knew each other from the same community center in Greensburg, a place that provided services to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Meidinger would later tell a jury that Jennifer trusted her, and that the reason she trusted her was that she knew her from there. Standing at that bus station, in ordinary conversation, Jennifer said something to Amber Meidinger. She said she was going to marry Ricky Smyrnes. Angela Marinucci overheard it. Meidinger testified that she noticed the tension immediately. that something changed in that moment between Marinucci and Jennifer, right there, in public, before anyone had gone anywhere. They all went back to the apartment together. Jennifer had told her mother she was staying at Peggy's, and Peggy was there. So as far as Jennifer understood it, that's exactly what was happening. In reality, the apartment was Smyrnes's. Her mother had the wrong address and didn't know it. What happened first was small, almost petty. Testimony described her belongings being gone through and her money taken. A woman with no job and no way to get more of it, in a town 10 miles from her house, in the snow. That's the moment the arrangement changed. Not with violence, with theft. Before anyone laid a hand on her, they had already decided she wasn't a guest in that apartment. She was something to take from. The violence followed within hours. And here is what I want you to hold on to through everything that comes next. There were 5 other adults in that apartment. There was a family living in the apartment directly below. There were neighbors on either side. That building sat on a residential street in a city of 15,000 people. Not one door opened. Over the next 2 days, what happened to Jennifer Daugherty escalated in a pattern that investigators, prosecutors, and eventually 4 separate juries would all recognize as deliberate. She was beaten with objects taken from around the apartment, a towel rack, a crutch, a vacuum hose. She was forced to swallow mixtures made from cleaning products, prescription medication, and human waste. Her hair was cut off. Nail polish was used to mark her face. Her wrists and ankles were bound with the empty wire from strings of Christmas lights after the bulbs had been pulled out, with garland wrapped around her ankles. At some point during those 2 days, she was also sexually assaulted. Now, I could keep listing. The record is long, and the details are worse than what I've just said. But listing them isn't the point, and it isn't what tells you what was actually happening in that apartment. Look at the pattern instead. Take her money, take her clothes, take her hair. Paint her face so she doesn't look like herself. Make her swallow things no person would swallow. Tie her up with holiday decorations and mock her. Every single one of those acts is doing the same job. Not one of them is about pain. They're about erasing a person. Taking a 30-year-old woman with a family and a home and a bus pass and a doctor's appointment and converting her, step by step, into something that isn't a person anymore. Because once she isn't a person, the vote becomes possible. And there were votes. Smyrnes called them family meetings. That's the phrase the 6 of them used, and it's the phrase that appears in the court record. When there was a decision to be made about Jennifer, the group convened, and the group decided. Not once, repeatedly, over 2 days in that apartment, a small governing body assembled itself around a woman tied up on the floor and put her treatment to a vote. That is the detail that makes this case what it is. Nothing here was a loss of control. Nothing here was a fight that went too far. It was procedural. And through all of it, Jennifer kept asking one question. The reporter who sat through Amber Meidinger's testimony wrote it plainly. Jennifer Daugherty never got an answer to her repeated questions about why this was happening to her. She asked. Over and over, for 2 days, she asked the people doing it why they were doing it. She thought they were her friends, right up until the end. Part of her still did. Wednesday, February 10th, Ricky Smyrnes called the group together again. By the account given under oath, this was the 3rd family meeting, and this time the question he put to the room was whether Jennifer should be killed. 6 people were in that apartment. Ricky Smyrnes, Angela Marinucci, Melvin Knight, Amber Meidinger, Peggy Miller, Robert Masters. The vote was unanimous. Not one abstention. Not one person who said no, or said wait, or got up and walked out of the room, and down the stairs, and into the street where there was a phone. 6 votes. All 6 the same. Then Smyrnes made her write a suicide note. I'm not going to read it to you. What matters isn't the wording, it's what he told her while she was writing it. He told her the plan was to make her death look like she'd done it herself. So she understood. Sitting there, bound, at the end of 2 days, holding a pen, she understood exactly what the note was for and exactly what was about to happen. And what she wrote was addressed to her family. She used it to tell them she loved them. What happened next took only minutes. Smyrnes handed a knife to Melvin Knight, and Knight stabbed her. Smyrnes cut her wrists. When she did not die from her injuries, they strangled her with the Christmas lights that had been used to tie her. Jennifer Daugherty died on the floor of an apartment on North Pennsylvania Avenue, roughly 10 miles from her mother's house. And then Ricky Smyrnes called one more family meeting. This one was about what to do with her body. They put her in a plastic bag, and they put the bag inside a plastic garbage can. Sometime before dawn on Thursday, February 11th, Smyrnes and Knight took it out of the apartment. They came back and told the others where they'd left it. They weren't as invisible as they thought. A woman named Rebecca Clark was being driven to work in the dark that morning, and she saw 2 men on Main Street dragging a garbage can through the snow near the middle school. She didn't know what she was looking at. She'd remember it later, when it was on the news. They left her in a parking lot at Greensburg Salem Middle School, pushed underneath a parked service truck in a snowstorm. They believed the weather would cover it. The weather covered it for a matter of hours. Thursday morning, February 11th, 2010. Greensburg Salem Middle School. The parking lot is buried under the second snowstorm in a week. A man named Daniel Grant walks out to his service truck, and there's a plastic garbage can shoved underneath it that wasn't there before. He moves it. You already know what's inside. You've known since the first 60 seconds of this video, but you didn't know then what you know now. You didn't know she called her mother every day and ended every call the same way. You didn't know she rode that bus alone, because doing things alone mattered more to her than almost anything. You didn't know she'd left a note on the kitchen counter that morning telling her mom to have a good day at work. That's the difference between a body in a parking lot and Jennifer Lee Daugherty. And there's one more thing about where they left her. They didn't choose a river. They didn't choose woods or a landfill or the side of a highway. They chose the parking lot of a middle school, a place where, on any ordinary Thursday, several hundred children arrive on foot at 8 in the morning. 2 days of snow meant the schools were closed. That's the only reason it was Daniel Grant who found her. She hadn't been there long. Before dawn that same morning, a woman named Rebecca Clark was being driven to work through the dark and saw 2 men on Main Street near the school, dragging a garbage can through the snow. She had no idea what she was looking at. She would remember it a few hours later when it was on the news. Jennifer had been due home on Tuesday. She didn't arrive, and she didn't call, which for Jennifer was the thing that didn't happen rather than the thing that did. 30 years of daily phone calls, and then silence. Her family reported her missing. And when police asked where she had been going, the family gave them what they had: a friend's house on Pennsylvania Avenue in Greensburg. They believed it was Peggy's. That was all investigators needed, because the address on Pennsylvania Avenue wasn't Peggy Miller's. It was Ricky Smyrnes's. And when officers went to that second-floor apartment, they found 5 of the 6 people who had been living in it. On February 12th, 1 day after Jennifer's body was found, all 6 were charged with criminal homicide, kidnapping, and related offenses. Every one of them was ordered held without bond in the Westmoreland County Prison. Robert Loren Masters, Jr., 36. Ricky Smyrnes, 23. Melvin Knight, 20. Amber Meidinger, 20. Peggy Darlene Miller, 27. And a 17-year-old girl who could not be named in the first press reports. There was no manhunt. There was no mystery. There was no forensic breakthrough, no cold trail, no years of dead ends. Because the thing that broke this case open was the 6 of them. According to police, all 6 admitted their involvement and implicated the others within hours. Melvin Knight told investigators he was the one who stabbed her, and that he and Smyrnes had carried her body out to the parking lot. The same group that had spent 2 days voting in unison turned on each other almost the moment the door opened. Whatever that apartment had been, it did not survive its first contact with a police interview room. What came out afterward is harder to sit with than the arrests. 3 inmates from the county prison would later testify that Angela Marinucci talked about what she'd done, that she bragged about it, made jokes about it, to people in custody with her. That testimony is exactly that, testimony given by inmates, tested in front of a jury, but it's part of the record, and juries heard it more than once. Meanwhile, something unusual was happening 2 counties over. In October of 2009, 4 months before Jennifer died, President Obama had signed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. For the first time, federal hate crime law covered crimes motivated by a victim's disability. The acting United States Attorney in Pittsburgh, Robert Sesser, announced that his office was reviewing Jennifer's murder under that statute. It was too early, he said, to know whether federal charges would follow. For a few weeks, this case, in a town of 15,000 people, became a national conversation. NPR covered it. Disability rights advocates watched it closely. The question on the table was whether what happened in that apartment counted as a crime committed because Jennifer had a disability, or simply one made possible by it. Federal charges were never filed. All 6 were prosecuted in Pennsylvania state court. But the question that case raised has never really gone away. And then there was the autopsy. It was performed by Dr. Cyril Wecht, the former Allegheny County coroner, one of the most recognized forensic pathologists in the United States, a man who spent decades consulting on the most examined deaths in American history. Wecht took the stand at Ricky Smyrnes' penalty trial and described what had been done to Jennifer Daugherty. He told the jury it ranked among the most horrific cases he had ever seen. He described one defenseless woman, 6 people holding her captive, all of them knowing she was intellectually disabled. He called it extreme barbarism. The case was solved in 2 days. Justice would take 12 years. Angela Marinucci went first. In May of 2011, a Westmoreland County jury convicted her on all 6 counts against her, including first-degree murder. Jennifer's mother, father, and sister held hands in the courtroom while the verdict was read. Because she was 17 when Jennifer died, the death penalty was never available. She received life without parole. And then the law shifted underneath her. The United States Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional. Her sentence was overturned. She was resentenced in 2017, and that was overturned too, because it still left no possibility of parole. In 2022, Judge Rita Hathaway sentenced Angela Marinucci for the 3rd time. 40 years to life for the murder, a consecutive 20 to 40 years for conspiracy. In January of 2024, the Pennsylvania Superior Court upheld it and noted that she had never taken responsibility for what she did. Melvin Knight pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. Ricky Smyrnes was convicted of it at trial in 2013, after the judge refused to let his jury hear anything about his mental capacity during the guilt phase. Both men were sentenced to death. Neither has been executed. Pennsylvania has not carried out an execution since 1999, and successive governors have kept a moratorium in place since 2015. Both men remain on death row more than a decade into their appeals. Amber Meidinger, The witness the entire prosecution rested on pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, 40 to 80 years. At her sentencing, Joy Burkholder stood up and told the court that she felt nothing for her, that she believed Meidinger was remorseful, and that she should be. Years later, Meidinger applied for clemency, writing that she wanted a second chance at a life outside. Judge Hathaway wrote a one-paragraph letter to the State Pardons Board opposing it. John Peck said this was one of the most horrific crimes in the county in 50 years, and that his office would not cooperate with the request. Robert Masters pleaded guilty, 30 to 70 years. He stood up in court and said he had been scared for his life, that he should have done something, and he didn't. He asked whether the family could forgive him, and Peggy Miller, Jennifer's friend, the name Jennifer gave her mother on the telephone, was sentenced to 35 to 74 years. She read her apology with her back turned to Jennifer's family, and then she said this. She said Jennifer was her friend, and that she should not have voted for her to die. 12 years. 3 sentencings for 1 defendant, 4 juries, 1 judge presiding over all of it. A judge who later said this case had affected her more than any other in more than 2 decades on the bench. Now, there's a part of this story you'll find repeated almost everywhere online, and I need to be careful with it, because I don't think it's accurate. In 2010, in the weeks after Jennifer died, State Senator Kim Ward, who represents Westmoreland County, announced she would introduce legislation named for her, Jennifer's Law. It would have made it a third-degree misdemeanor to witness a violent crime and fail to report it to police, with an exception for anyone who would be put in physical danger by reporting. Ward pushed it publicly. She gave interviews about it. She raised it again at a conference in April of 2012. And that is where the trail goes cold. You will find articles, videos, and encyclopedia entries stating flatly that Jennifer's Law was signed into law in 2012. I went looking for it. Pennsylvania's criminal code does contain a failure to report statute, but it applies to doctors and hospital staff treating gunshot wounds and injuries from criminal acts. It is not a general duty for bystanders, and it predates Jennifer's death by decades. I could not find Jennifer's Law in the Pennsylvania statutes. I could not find a signing. I could not find a bill number that became an act. I'd encourage you to check for yourself. But as best I can determine, the law named after Jennifer Daugherty was proposed, publicized, and never passed, which means the thing that killed her is still legal in Pennsylvania. Not the murder, the watching. And that matters beyond this one case, because what happened to Jennifer is the extreme version of something ordinary. Adults with intellectual disabilities are victimized at rates dramatically higher than the general population. They are less likely to be believed when they report it, and they are often targeted precisely because the people around them calculate that no one will listen. Jennifer was targeted for exactly that reason. Her stepfather, Bobby Murphy, said afterward that closure would be Jennifer coming back to them, and Jennifer wasn't coming back, so there was no closure. Her sister Joy said her biggest regret was pushing Jennifer to act like an adult. She should never have had to carry that. Jennifer was an adult. Wanting her to have a life of her own wasn't a mistake. It was love. 6 people in a second-floor apartment made it look like a mistake, and that's on them. So let's end where she was. On a Monday morning in February, a 30-year-old woman left a note on the kitchen counter telling her mother to have a good day at work. Her stepfather drove her to the bus station. She kissed him on the cheek. She had an appointment the next day, and she was going to stay over with a friend, and she was looking forward to it. That's all she was doing. Jennifer Daugherty believed that everyone she met was good. She was wrong exactly once. And the law that carries her name exists, in name only. because 5 other people in that apartment could have proved her right, and not one of them did. That's the case. If you take one thing away from it, take this. You don't need a law to make the call. If you ever suspect an adult with a disability is being hurt, Pennsylvania's Adult Protective Services hotline is staffed 24 hours a day. The number is in the description, along with every source used in this video. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. It wasn't an easy 40 minutes. I'll keep covering cases like Jennifer's, the ones where somebody could have stopped it and didn't. If you want to be here for those, subscribe. Take care of each other.